Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to TPOG, the podcast of gaming, presented by TBOG for episode 9, where I am joined here today by Cora
Good afternoon.
and Max.
Remember me?
Yes, it's been a little bit of a while since we had these two on the podcast together, but it's nice to have them back. Today we're going to be discussing a bit more of a broader topic around lots of different issues that are going on in the gaming industry nowadays. Or perhaps even perceived issues. We're going to discuss them and just see where we think the gaming industry is at in terms of like multiple different things such as budgeting, development time, release rate of games, less niche titles being able to be published, lots of little small things. So a bit more like last episode, but a lot of little subjects that we're going to be going over the next hour or so. So I want to kick things off straight away with you, Max, jumping into a discussion about how there's fewer releases nowadays. So before I hand over to you, I'll just kind of give the audience a bit of an introduction. So basically, for anyone who's been gaming for a fair long while now, any more than about 10 years, you probably will have noticed that certain developers are releasing games significantly slower than they used to. So one example I came up with just before we started recording was Grand Theft Auto, Rockstar Games back in the day. The GTA trilogy, 3, Vice City, and San Andreas, considering how big they were and how impactful they came out 1 year after each other. That was 3 years. And then they released Vice City stories and Liberty City stories on top of that, all in the span of one generation. GTA 5, the most recent GTA game, came out in 2013 and now spans 3 console generations and has not had a follow-up release since then. Now, there are many different reasons for that. Obviously, monetization is a huge part of it. It's the second best-selling game of all time. But there's also so much more to be taken into account in terms of just how long development cycles are nowadays and how few games developers can get out while still maintaining some sense of a decent work culture. So, Max, I'm going to hand over to you now. What's your initial thoughts on this topic and where you think we're at in the gaming industry right now?
Yes. So, I think, in terms of, like, morally speaking, I think, like, in general, it's a good thing that developers are being allowed to take their time more with games, even if it does, like, potentially result in, like, fewer new titles for the consumer. Let's think about, like, another example that you mentioned in sort of the same vein as GTA. Like, Final Fantasy, for example. Okay, so if you remember, like, back in, like, the mid-90s to early 2000s, let's say starting with FF7, we had, all right, so going from, FF7 to Kingdom Hearts, we had FF7, FF8, FF9, and FF10. That's 4 games in about 5 years. And, then when Kingdom Hearts came out, everyone was waiting for 2. And, Kingdom Hearts 2, that took about 4 years later to come out, 3 or 4 years later to come out. And, that was a long time to wait back then for, like, a new mainline sequel. But, like, when you think about it nowadays, that's not really, like, relatively speaking, much time to wait for a new game in your series at all. But, like, it was almost unprecedented then. And, Final Fantasy sort of went down a similar route, with it taking, more time between 10 to 11 and 11 to 12. And, especially, like, with the past few titles from, 13 to 14 to 15, there's been, like, huge stretches of time between those. But, I think in general, like, a big part of that, in addition to budgeting and, like, new technology and stuff, and, optimizations and all that, taking a while to use, a lot of the workplace culture has sort of changed. And, I think part of that has to do with, people shedding a light on, some of the massive crunch issues that have been going on in, the gaming industry. Because if you look back at, a lot of older games, like, people think that crunch is, okay, yeah, I've just been told that I'm talking a little too fast, but yeah, okay. So you've probably seen over the past few years, a lot of stories about, crunch related controversies in the gaming industry. People being forced to work like a lot of overtime with no extra pay and things like that. And sorry, okay. And that is like that's not really a new thing in the industry. A lot of people sort of think that it might be sort of a newer problem just because it's being discussed more. But if you look back at, for example, some of the old King of Fighters games and some of the dev stories around that, it's pretty clear that crunch was just as bad, if not worse, back in the day. But there wasn't really much of a spotlight put on it, so it was just sort of allowed to continue. So yeah, in general, I would say that, yeah, games are undeniably taking longer to come out, but, there is, like, a very good moral reason for that. There are some issues that we are resolving in the industry, like, and, this is just sort of a side effect of that.
Call me a bit of a cynic, but I'm not quite sure if ethical purposes are kind of leading the way on this charge. Um, when it comes to the two kind of headliner examples that have already been brought up, GTA and Final Fantasy, I mean, the big word for me, Per, and you can agree with this, is multiplayer when it comes to GTA, especially. Like, what motivates Rockstar to put in the time and effort to develop a new gen game when they can just add patches and new content drops to an existing infrastructure?
And
Yeah.
I think that.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry. Yeah,
sorry. Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead.
Yeah. So in regards to GTA specifically, I don't think it's a secret to anyone why it's lasted as long as it has. For me, it's a more extreme example. As I said earlier, it's the second best selling game of all time. That ain't because of the single player. It's because of the multiplayer, and people just keep buying it and spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars on GTA Online dollars, and it makes them unbelievably wealthy. So yeah, GTA is a bit of an extreme example, but I'd like to throw it back to another example that I can think of, which is Naughty Dog, who are another one of the more preeminent developers in the industry right now, or AAA developers in the industry right now, I should say. They used to come out with at least 3 or 4 games a generation. If you think about the PS3 generation, 3 Uncharted games and the first Last of Us game. But in the entirety of the last generation, it was Uncharted 4. I guess you could count the Lost Legacy, but that was kind of like half a game. It wasn't even like a full game. And The Last of Us Part 2, there's definitely a massive slowdown, and those are games that, while they had multiplayer, didn't obviously depend heavily on them, and I think actually most of those servers are shut down now. So while in the case of GTA, it is most certainly the multiplayer was enormously successful, in other studios there is very clearly a something's happening where development cycles are just taking so long to complete nowadays.
Okay, well, let me open up the floor to a different idea then, which I feel like is also important, and that has to do with, the amount of effort that's put into like realism and graphical fidelity. I think that's the right term. You know, when they were, Max, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but back in the late '90s, early 2000s, I feel like, especially games like Final Fantasy and Fire Emblem, you weren't really focusing on it looking phenomenal. Um, and then 10 was a bit more, I think, graphically involved, but um, it just requires a lot more technical effort. I think
I
now
mean,
is a big
it's.
portion.
I mean, to an extent, because one thing I want to bring up, like as another sort of potential counter to the multiplayer idea, God of War 2018 and God of War Ragnarok, those had about the normal amount of time between them, like about 4 or 5-ish years, between them, and those games, at least as far as I'm aware, don't have any multiplayer. It's just all single player. So it's a thing that affects pretty much all games, regardless of what kind of player count you're you know I guess accounting for in development. But yeah, as far as the graphical points go, it's sort of interesting because there were a lot of games that were, trying to go for something graphically impressive back then. But it's the main difference is, what is considered graphically impressive then versus today. Because back in the late '90s, if you could make a 3D clump of polygons move around, that vaguely resembled a person, that was impressive for the time. Mario 64, and Metal Gear Solid, that looked really impressive back in 96, 97, whenever that was, but it aged really quickly just a few years later because with the PS2 you could have people that actually sort of resembled people, you know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
there were definitely games that pushed for greater realism in terms of their visuals, but whether or not they aged very well in that regard is a different question.
Yeah, I guess to respond to that is the step up from 2D to vague 3D the same amount as the step up from, you know, 3D to more realism? Like, does it require the same? I kind of
Mhm.
look at this from an outsider. Does it require the same coding, the same amount of time, the same amount of compiling efforts, editing? Like, I understand that it was a big jump and there was ambition there, but was it just a matter of learning a new program? or was it, and then putting out some vague polygons, or was it a bit more involved than that?
Well, I know that between the three of us, Para's like the programming guy. If anyone's gonna know like a more exact answer to that, it's him. But
Yeah, sorry, that was an open question.
all right, but I do think there is a point to be made about optimization because yeah, technology, it is improving. With every console generation, you can make things look bigger and better and more realistic if you want to. But another part of that is, that's gonna require huge polygon counts. You got to account for like a whole bunch of different visual effects like ray tracing, bloom, all that kind of stuff, and that is going to, depending on what system you're developing for, that's going to put a bit on the processing power, and if you go too hard on it, you're just not going to have, very tolerable load times, for example, or you might have a lot of slowdown. So, a big part of it, today and, a bit in the past as well, but more so today, where, okay, we want this game to look impressive, but we also want it to be tolerable to play, without a bunch of slowed down and like, super hard load times and stuff like that. So I think that might also be where a bunch of time goes nowadays, optimization. I mean, that part's more just speculation on my end, but I'm gonna let Para have this particular topic, see what he has to say about it.
Well, I'll give you my very limited expertise as a game development student who has never once worked in the games industry. Um, for me, I think more so than anything, it comes down to the design aspect of the game. When something's 2D, it sounds very stupid and obvious, but like the level of what you have to consider is so much less because pretty much everything's on the screen at once, right? You're side scrolling or you're going up or down or whatever the methodology may be. You are focusing on a lot of at once, whereas you make the jump to 3D and all of a sudden it's not like the amount of things you have to consider is doubled. It's like there's 100 times more things you have to think about in terms of like all the terrain, where things are hidden, how the enemies respond in particular parts of maps. There's it just adds so much more. And again, failed game dev student, so I a lot of what I'm saying might sound stupid, but that jump was like that was the beginning of the game development cycle was getting longer and longer. And yes, at the beginning, the PS2, PS3 era, let's say for example, it wasn't quite as bad, but I don't know if it's necessarily that as opposed to just the general trend that AAA games are going nowadays, in that there's an increasing demand for perfection because of I have completely lost track of my point. I am sorry. I do not know where I'm going with this.
No,
Someone bail me out, please.
okay. Yeah.
Oh,
So,
I mean, does it tie back at all to like the optimization point from before, like how people expect greater optimization from games nowadays? Because like, back in the day, like if you had frame drops in a game, like I don't know, Banjo Tooie or something like that, people wouldn't care nearly as much, back then as they would like about like frame drops to that extent today. Like if your game dips below like I don't know 30 at any point, that's like a big black mark against it. Like at least depending on what the normal frame rate is, and depending on the genre, that's entirely understandable. But yeah, it's just a thing that people seem to care a bit more about these days, I think.
if a PC port drops below 60 FPS, people lose their mind.
Oh
Um,
yeah, no, I was thinking like like a console game, even if it goes below like a certain frame threshold. Again, depending on what kind of game you're making, yeah, it can be like a big deal for that game in a negative way.
so, Pear, to kind of tap into what you were saying about the orders of magnitude of difficulty from a 2D to a 3D. Is that why we see a lot of very successful indie games with small dev teams or even individual devs rely more on the 2D top-down or the side-scroller kind of Metroidvania approach because it is less demanding? Like,
Oh,
Stardew
100%.
Valley, Terraria, yeah.
I think 100%. I don't think that's the only thing at play. I think in many cases for indie games, the simplicity is incredibly attractive to a lot of gamers. There's so many AAA games nowadays overdo things, and there's so much to think of. There's so many mechanics and stuff, but the more successful indie games these days, I think they just have a real charm and simplicity about them that sort of harkens back to the way games used to be a couple, three or four generations ago. And I think for many people that's so appealing. Not to say that the way AAA games are built nowadays is fundamentally bad, but the indies just offer something different nowadays because because they have smaller teams, because they have lower budgets, they can't afford to do everything a AAA game can, and as such, they're not going to make the same sales. But the beauty that comes out of that is that they can make very refined, very focused, very I can't think of the right word, but like just very well-rounded projects that just focus on one or two particular things that they do really well, and that's how you get the really top tier indie games that succeed quite well. I mean, if you look at the VGAs nowadays, we talk a lot about like the token VGA candidate for Game of the Year. That's like an indie game, and they are really good games because what they do well is they just focus on what they do well, and it succeeds well. So yeah, I personally I think that's the biggest contributor to that personally, but that's just me.
Right, but I guess what I was trying to get at is that if you are a single developer or a team of 3 and you're looking to make a game, you're more likely to choose that style not only for the popularity of that specific style, but also because of the amount of the bandwidth that you can, devote to it compared to like a studio of 250 people and all of their models, like their face has 5,000 triangles on it. And and it's just like a billion times more effort is what I was trying to kind of get at when it comes to the amount of time that it takes to make these high-end games because of just the order of magnitude more of effort that's required in these late stage gens than was, when people were just rattling off similar hardwared games with just new stories within a year, with just A and B teams alternating. Like the Burnout, or not the Burnout series, the Need for Speed series was pretty similar in that regard. Of they had an A and a B team that just cycled every year, for who was making the game. Just like Call of Duty when they went between Infinity Ward and Treyarch.
Yeah, I do think COD's a really good example because I think we were discussing this in general a couple of weeks back. But it's the thing is with COD, it used to be Infinity Ward, Treyarch, and then they introduced Sledgehammer, I think. So they were doing like a 3-year cycle. But the thing is, it's not like one studio does one game a year and the next studio does the next game a year. It's like Infinity Ward makes the campaign, and then Sledgehammer makes the multiplayer, and then Raven Software or whatever it is makes Warzone, and they have like Toys for Bob coming in and helping. Like the amount of studios involved in that series just to make sure they have a consistent annual release schedule because it makes so much money is absurd, and as far as I'm aware, practically unheard of elsewhere in the games industry. Like they do the cycle, but the cycle is getting out of hand. Like, it's becoming more and more unsustainable for them to do because there's so many. Every year they want more modes. Warzone's so popular, so now they have to put a load of focus into Warzone. This year, for example, they added DMZ. That's another load of focus. And they have, like, a dozen, perhaps more studios working on every single release. The lines are becoming blurred. It's becoming this unsustainable vehicle of just, like, ridiculous development time condensed into 2 years. I think the development cycle usually is, but to get a game out every year, it's absurd. It's becoming ridiculous. It's becoming a growing problem.
I think that's going to become a kind of series where they decide that they're going to just build a base and then make content as buy-ins. Most of my experience of recent COD comes from the 2019 Modern Warfare, but with that Battle Pass system, with that Warzone system, I think they also had, what was it, the Specialist missions? Is that what that was called? The 4-man, yeah, that kind of stuff. I thought what they were probably going to do, and maybe it was too late to change course because they already were so deep in the development of the follow-up installment, the Cold War, was that I thought they were just going to park it right there and just do seasonal releases and just reap the Battle Pass money. But and I think that they're going to have to do that at some point because it's not like their last installments have really received the same amount of praise as that first one that the other 2 games are kind of based off of was kind of reaping.
Yeah, it's another general point in that when there is a noticeable drop in overall quality when games are coming out too rapidly nowadays, and it's not very often that happens nowadays, but again, taking COD as an example, another example, a good one would be Assassin's Creed. That hasn't done an annual release cycle for a while, but when it was doing it, the drop in quality from title to title was extremely noticeable. I mean, I'm sure you all remember Assassin's Creed Unity's launch and like just how much it got shredded for being. From what I've heard nowadays, it's from a design perspective, from a gameplay perspective, it's actually one of the better Assassin's Creeds. But at launch, it was a disaster. Bugs and glitches, the terrible like optimization and performance, it was awful. But this was the suffering at that point because they had been releasing an Assassin's Creed game, actually in one case, 2 Assassin's Creed games per year for the past 5 or 6 years by that point, because it was making money. It was just the easiest money they'd ever made, but it was getting unsustainable to that point, to the point they had to start slowing down and releasing games every 2 years. And now I think it's on a 3-year cycle as well. Even though they have,
That sounds right. Yeah.
they've just revealed about 5 or 6 different games they're going to be working on. But yeah, it's just another example of how while we do miss the back in the old days where we used to have games coming out like every year, it's simply not sustainable if we want to keep a consistent level of quality now. And I would not be surprised if Call of Duty heads in the direction that you said earlier, which is that, you know, we could end up with just like a base game that just gets added to. But when it keeps making, you know, when it keeps selling like 15 million plus every year, what reason do they have to do it?
Yeah, well, I just don't know what the cost is to do those developments compared to dropping in extra content and just managing the current servers. If it's more profitable to rip out a new thing every year to force people to buy it, I mean, that's how, all the EA Sports games make their money, is that, oh, you want the newest roster? Oh, you want to play, what's it, Ultimate Team?
Yeah.
With, like, where everyone else is playing? Better buy the new $70 game and drop in $100 worth of card packs if you want to hit the ground running and not get stomped as soon as you enter the lobbies.
Yeah, I actually didn't even thought about the EA Sports titles, but they're kind of in the same boat. They feel like they're heading towards breaking point as well, because they are. The thing is, I'll take FIFA as the example because that's the example I know best. That is a series.
The biggest one, I think.
Oh yeah, by some distance. That is a series that is probably, they could release it like this for time immemorial and it would sell the same every year, just because it is bought by and played by the sort of crowd that just don't give a flying fuck. They want the latest game so they can play with their friends, and they want the latest game so they can have the latest rosters. They don't give a shit about the rest of it. They might moan and complain that maybe their mode isn't quite as good as it used to be or something like that, but they're going to keep buying it. They don't have reason to change. So the only reason something like that will change is if like the development becomes untenable at a certain point, which seems unlikely for a series like that to me. So I kind of feel like the sports games are a bit of an outlier in that regard. But yeah, if everything went, if everything was like morally correct, then yeah, it should slow down, I guess, like to sort of like go in line with the rest of the industry, but unlikely to happen.
Yeah, I guess to refine the topic a bit more, because clearly dedicated single player and dedicated multiplayer games are given different development cycles due to anticipated ROIs. Like, if I were to make, Halo Infinite, in the planning stage, I would have anticipated, it's like, oh, we're probably going to get 5, 6, 7, 10 years out of this game if we keep it, up to snuff. I mean, League of Legends, what are we on? 14 years of that spaghetti code game, just constantly getting new stuff put on top of it. I feel like those dedicated multiplayer games get much longer cycles, of course. There hasn't been a new Rainbow Six. It's not like we're getting a Fortnite 2, stuff like that. No, we're not going to get Dota 3, not a new Counter-Strike. So, I mean, until the current framework is so decrepit that they have to build it from scratch, or it just falls into being broken all the time. So I think that obviously sits in a different playing field than the single player games, because I feel like the single player games that we were bringing up, or all the games that we were bringing up from the majority standpoint, were these single player titles, these God of Wars, these. We didn't talk about Horizon Zero Dawn, but that falls under this purview. The Uncharted versus The Last of Us cycle. These are all, single player story games that the only return on investment that you will get outside of the initial purchase is if you do a DLC or a re-release.
Yeah. So that kind of leads into the topic I wanted to move on to next a little bit. So
Go
when
ahead.
you... Oh, sorry.
I said, yeah, go ahead.
All right, okay. So yeah, Max, when you raised up the topic initially on Discord, you mentioned that we are seeing less niche titles now, and like maybe less. There's definitely more of a focus on massive, big brand names that that publishers know will make 10 million, sales plus every time. Sony's a brilliant example of this. Obviously, they focus on their Last of Us, they focus on their God of War, their Horizon. You don't see things like, Little Big Planet anymore. I know a Sackboy game came out, but let's just not talk about that.
When like Ape Escape and Sly
Yeah,
Cooper, Jack and Daxter, those kind of series have been like,
exactly. Yeah,
MIA for almost a decade or more, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I was sort of wanting to transition back into that too because on the subject of indies, like when those were brought up like a few minutes ago, like I was thinking that the rise in popularity of indie games, could I guess sort of reflect this sort of shift in like the major development studios because I mean if you think about it, like indie games did exist, like on the market, like pretty much since the beginning. But like it wasn't until I want to say the PS3 era that they started really taking off. Because I mean, like okay, back in the early 2000s, for example, you had stuff like Shantae on the Game Boy Color or Alien Hominid on the GameCube, for example. Those were indie games, and like they did all right. But it wasn't until the PS3 era that you started seeing stuff for example, like Shovel Knight or Limbo or, those kind of games, really like, making a sort of impact, in gaming culture. And, I think, it might be because that was around the point when indies being as simple and retro as they tend to be, were starting to offer something that we weren't really seeing much of from these companies anymore. Because, okay, back in the early 2000s, for example, like what would something like Shantae or Alien Hominid, offer in terms of their gameplay or style that, you couldn't get from, a similar platformer either from that era or just a few years ago on the previous generation. But nowadays, or starting with the PS3 era and going forward, these games are made in a style, that's not done as much anymore these days. And I think like some of the biggest examples of that are, modern indies that deliberately replicate, a particular style of game that hasn't really been done in a while. Like I think Bug Fables is a great example where, that game in terms of its aesthetics and gameplay is directly meant to evoke the style of Paper Mario that hasn't really been seen since Thousand Year Door. And Pizza Tower, that one that just came out recently and has been doing really well. That one is pretty much designed to invoke like the old style of Wario Land games that haven't been seen since the Wii era, for example. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe that's one of the big reasons why indies have been, getting so much more successful. The fact that they are like offering something that, game developers used to be able to do, but nowadays, it's been more important to them to focus their budgets on like these titles that are that in their minds at least are more guaranteed to bring in like huge money. And I think another part of that, besides inflation and besides rising development costs, there is something to be said about okay, before I move on to this particular point, did you guys already cover like how much money the publishers actually get from like physical and digital game sales at all, like in any previous episode?
Not that I recall.
Okay, so I remember a while back, I was looking into, how the $60 that you spend on a game, how that actually is distributed. And, a good chunk of it, goes towards the distributor, like the store itself. A good chunk of it goes to returns, like for unsold stock. Another good portion of it goes to the platform holder, for the royalties and stuff like that. Less than half, of a $60 game sale actually goes to the publisher. And and digital sales aren't that much better because like with digital sales, okay, you don't really have to deal with like the physical store costs or anything like that. But the platform holder, the store owner, they still take a 30% cut. So, realistically speaking, the publishers, on a $60 game sale, they aren't making that much per sale. So, they have to sell a lot more to break even. And like, yeah, that was like a thing back in the day too. But nowadays, with rising development costs and inflation and all that, they have to sell even more to break even than they would before. And I think that's another reason why, a lot of devs are sort of, trending towards like these big mass market, sort of titles rather than like more niche entries or more niche series. And whereas indies don't have that problem quite as badly because, okay, they self-publish. That's a big reason. They pretty much only do digital. I mean, they might get a physical game once they do really well, but for the most part, they're taking the digital option, which gives them a bit more of a cut than they would physically, for example. And because they're not putting nearly as much money into it, they don't have to sell nearly as much to break even. So yeah, indies are allowed to take more risks, primarily because of that, I think. And because of the way the world is, these bigger studios, these bigger publishers, they can't really do the same thing, at least not nearly as often.
So I have a quick question. Which
Yeah.
console generation had the online store for digital downloads?
I'm If I had, I'm pretty sure that was like the seventh gen because That's where we started seeing stuff like PSN, Xbox Live Arcade, the Wii Shop channel, for example. I mean, there was DLC before then. Like I think the Xbox might have had DLC at some point. I think the Dreamcast had like a really primitive form of DLC, for example. But yeah, that the seventh gen was where we really started seeing like these digital storefronts, take a major like presence in the gaming industry, at least as far as I remember.
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds right to me.
Sarah, do you remember when PlayStation started to do their free games of the month?
Well, for PlayStation Plus, so
Yeah.
that would have been, I want to say, 2008 maybe.
Okay. So the point that I'm trying to get to on this one was is it the opinion for Max's specific indie topic is that the online store and the ability for the consoles to give some of these lesser games away for free to kind of buy in some interest contributed to this popularity in some way on the console side?
Do you want to cover that, pair, or do you want me to
Okay,
I
like?
just want an
you
opinion.
Well, I mean,
you take
so
this one for now, Max.
I mean, I think in general, yeah, being able, yeah, because indies don't need as much money to break even, I think, they are, a lot more likely and a lot more willing to, be part of like, game bundles and stuff like that. That's more likely to get a lot of people like, more interested in other stuff from those games, from those studios and like other like games in those styles. So I do think that indies in general tend to benefit more from those kind of bundles that, than maybe a AAA would, for example. I mean, that's not to say a AAA can't like benefit from like a free game trial or whatever or anything like that. There have been free game trials for games from a lot of bigger studios in the past, but indies they seem to be like the go-to for that sort of thing. They tend to populate the sort of bundles a lot more than like major titles would, and I think that makes sense. Like I do think indies, they generally have a lot less to lose in that respect, I suppose, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. I suppose I just want to contextualize it a little bit more as to like contributing reasons why that era might be when that started, because I know that younger me, if I was going to go buy a game at a store, it was going to be a game that I knew that I wanted to get. And then if I saw like a game on, the storefront featured page that was like 90% off on a winter sale for like $2, I go, okay, I'll check it out. Um, to kind of get to another point that you brought up about, game developers, especially the AAA developers, going for games that they know will sell enough to break even on their investment. I was trying to look up the quote, but I unfortunately couldn't find it. But in the movie industry, there was a quote that said the most creative films get made during a recession. which means that when the money's bad is when we are more likely to see riskier films because no matter what they put out, there's a high likelihood that it wouldn't sell anyways, I
That does
guess.
sound accurate, to be fair. Yeah.
I've
Right.
never heard of that quote before, but it sounds interesting, and there might be some truth to it.
So, yeah, my what I was kind of getting at is that I wonder if the game industry mirrors the film industry in that way, in that the reason why there are very few, out there AAA games is because the executives at these companies see no reason to take a risk because there is no fear of not selling. If if the times were more troubling, I think that's when we would see these kind of more experimental big titles coming out. If that makes sense, I'm kind of just spitballing.
I get where you're coming from. For me, an interesting question is related to this. So what's considered? So you said for film industry, it's like during a recession, which is obviously a more specific example, but the games industry has been on absolutely meteoric growth and rise for a very long time now, and it hasn't really had like a
Right.
dip. And the pandemic helped it boosted it along, whereas other industries flatlined during that time, and it's not really dipped at all. So the question then becomes like, are we ever going to see a dip again where we might see a bit more creative? I think your logic, whoever it was initially said the quote, actually is very sound. Obviously, the less money involved and the less chance there is to make a profit, the more likely are to greenlight a project. Because, like you said, one way or another, it's probably not going to make that much money. So you can be a bit more risky. You could try something a bit new. For the games industry, are we ever going to see anything like that again? Because it just doesn't seem like the industry is going to stop growing. It does, although I could definitely see us heading towards like an implosion point at some point, given what we discussed earlier in the episode around higher development costs and longer development cycles. But is it something we're going to see again? It's kind of difficult for me to see it, to be honest.
Well, from an
Yeah.
economics perspective, there's no such thing as an infinite bull run. So at some point, there will be a problem. It's just that what that problem will be and how it will manifest itself is so far above my pay grade that I couldn't even venture a guess as to what that environment would look like.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, like, back in the day, like, even, like, just a few years ago, like, people were speculating about, like, a potential market crash similar to what we saw in '83, but, so far, it really doesn't seem like that's happened. Games are doing, just as well today as they've ever been, at least as far as I've heard, and, yeah, but as Cora mentioned, that kind of growth, like it's not going to keep up forever. There's eventually going to be some kind of dip. There's going to be some kind of peak that we're just not going to be able to pass again, and we'll probably, we might sort of plateau around it. It might dip down for a while. Who knows? But yeah, like infinite growth, as much as companies like to push for that, just isn't a realistic thing. So, I think eventually, like, we'll get to a point where, the market, like, sort of dwindles down. And I want to say part of that is, potentially due to, how much longer it's going to take for games to come out, because, eventually, like, it could get to a point where, okay, having a, decent sized lineup for any given year just isn't going to be possible when, a whole bunch of stuff is, still in development, compared to, and, not ready, in time for a certain day. But, in terms of, I kind of lost track of where I was going, but I think maybe, I mean, it could be as companies get larger, they could, like, have enough like smaller studios under their belt to keep a lineup going like each year. But I mean, that's a whole other topic. I don't want to get too much into, like, studio acquisitions and things like that. But yeah, I feel, and the fact that there is so much more time between major installments and like these big name series, that could like just generate more excitement and more interest in whatever new installments come out, which in turn gives them more profits when those do eventually sell. So Who knows? I really couldn't tell you. Like, whether we'll see like a major dip or a major rise or anything like that anytime soon.
If you wanted me to venture a guess as to what this could manifest itself as, is to put aside monopolization of the gaming industry. That a studio flops on one of these like the cycles grow, and a studio flops on like a 6 year long cycle game, and they get eaten up. To put that one to the side, it would be if like the technology reaches a plateau where next gen doesn't exist anymore. Like we've hit the point where you can't increase the fidelity to an appreciable degree, and so the studios would have to rely on new IPs, new ideas, because at that point there's no more remasters, there's no more stuff along those lines, and if those times for development get too long, how do you generate hype for that IP? How do you
One
keep
thing
people
I
interested in the game?
one thing I will say, like, in terms of increasing fidelity, like, pretty much every generation or so, like, yeah, pretty much every console generation since like the PS1, for example, like, people have thought, man, there's no way it'll get better than this. And in the PS3 era, people were like, yeah, but how do you make these graphics like even better? They already look like real life, but somehow, like, when the PS4 and the PS5 come around, the other consoles of their generations, yeah, they do, like, at least try to improve the visuals somewhat. And I'm thinking, as technology like increases, we might see, like, okay, let's say that if the graphical fidelity like hits some sort of plateau, they might still have some other technological innovation to maybe try and make the game more immersive in other ways. Like, I know that VR's taken, like, a lot of prominence nowadays. Maybe they could sort of experiment with that. Maybe there'll be some other big revolutionary thing that, a lot of games have to account for, other systems have to account for, that, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, and I get that's not necessarily increasing fidelity, that's more going in a different direction. But, I do think that, in like the sort of hardware arms race, either something like that'll come along, or they'll increase the fidelity, even further beyond what we're currently imagining. Like, that's sort of what I'm thinking.
It would have to be a major technological revolution, though, because I think it is without debate that the jump, but let's just use the PlayStation example. PS1 to PS2, pretty big jump. PS2 to PS3, a noticeably smaller jump. 3 to 4, even smaller. 4 to 5 is minuscule, I would say.
Yeah.
Perry, you can counter me on that if
No,
you
I
want, but
fully agree. It's the jumpers. I mean, the most noticeable differences with the PS5 is loading times, really. Like, they are
right,
more or less gone, but beyond that, nothing really.
Uh, Yeah, I do think the biggest like draws in terms of like, improvements and changes will be in things like performance and like, storage and things like that. And there will still be small jumps in fidelity. I mean, like we did go from, HD to like 4K, for example, and like, yeah, that was a pretty significant jump, even if it wasn't quite as, even if it wasn't quite as big as going from SD to HD, for example. But yeah, like I do still think that small improvements in fidelity will happen between console generations. They'll just have to optimize and revolutionize in other ways, like, because like improving fidelity even further, like, it'll still be a jump, but not a big enough jump. I think that people will be interested specifically for that. I think.
yeah. I don't want to rabbit hole this too hard, but I have one last question. Para, what would it take for you to feel like it was a worthwhile investment to go from a PS5 to a PS6 in the future?
Oh, that is a tough one. I don't know. This is the thing. It's difficult to the only thing that really justifies console releases to me now is they get a bit old and a bit tired. But as someone who primarily plays on PC nowadays, with every generation, I'm finding it harder and harder to justify it. And I can't answer your question because, to be honest with you, I don't know. Like, the only thing I could think of is if, like, there was, like, a big jump in technology that I'm not sure I could even describe because it doesn't exist yet, that could justify the sort of thing. Like, VR is a good example, but VR's not, that's separate from console generations. I mean, we just had
You would have to
PlayStation
buy
VR 2.
VR, yeah.
Yeah. That we just had PlayStation VR 2 release, which is a PS5 thing, but it's another $550 on top of the PS5. It's not a console generation thing. So unless there's something they can come up with, like you take, for example, Nintendo, obviously the Switch gimmick of it being portable, that's a huge thing. But that's not something I could have foreseen ahead of time. But if something like that could happen of equal magnitude and equal convenience and equal just coolness in general, then I could justify it. But if not, it's hard. It's hard to justify it. And you kind of end up just buying a console because you want to keep playing the games. And if you don't buy the new console, you can't keep playing the games. So that's
you reach
basically what it is.
obsolescence.
Exactly, yeah.
And I mean, personally speaking, I'm still waiting for, a reason to jump from the PS4 to the PS5 even, like let alone thinking about jumping from PS5 to PS6. Especially with so many, games made for PS5 also being made for PS4, like and I think that's a big thing too, because yeah, like the PS5, the new Xbox, they're still doing well, but so many people, even like, a good couple years into this current gen, still haven't moved, they still haven't jumped, to the new gen yet. So that's why, a lot of games nowadays, they're, cross-gen, as, the term is. Like, games are also being made for the PS4 and Xbox One, still all these years later, that are also being made for, PS5 and, the new Xboxes. And, the fact is, there really aren't a whole lot of generation exclusives, for this current generation. Like, there isn't a lot on PS5 or Xbox One that you can't either get on PC or on, the previous, console generation counterparts to the PS5 and the newer Xbox. And I think that might even be saying something, because like it's suggesting that I'm not alone in thinking that there really isn't enough of a draw for me to get a PS5 now, after a PS4.
Yeah, so let's take this and apply it to the PC now. Um, you know, how much farther can we advance game engines? How much farther can we increase our graphical technology? There's going to be a point where, a game made in, let's say, 2025 is almost indistinguishably visually from a game made in 2030, as an example. And maybe I'm just kind of like spinning my wheels with no real direction, but I feel like that is the point where the the content of the game that you're trying to produce becomes more and more valuable, because if every AAA game studio is releasing like a similar, let's just say Inventory of Destiny, we've seen it all, with Ubisoft open world, with let's just, I don't know what a really good example of like a ubiquitous combat system is, but let's just say that that keeps happening. What motivates you to even explore those single player games outside of, oh, I like the theming of this one better than the theming of the other ones, knowing that you'll probably get the same experience regardless? If that made sense.
I sort of got lost a little bit, but I really don't have too much to contribute other than, yeah, there probably should be some kind of big revolution in terms of like, I guess just how games are designed or what's possible for them to do. If we're going to incentivize people to, I guess, jump on board, the next gen. It's not going to be, just for, single player, or multiplayer or whatever. Like, it's not just going to be, it's not going to have to be just a jump for those. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm losing myself here, but
Yeah, that's all
yeah.
right. Anyways, what I was trying to kind of get at is that this is the horizon that I see, which would be the big catalyst for a change in games. Is that we get to a playing field where um, things take a long time to develop. That development time does not get you major gains upon your previous projects, because the graphical fidelity hasn't upgraded, the hardware is only marginally getting better, yada yada. But I think that's when we get into this kind of plateau that we'll see something happen. And as a consumer, I'm already kind of feeling that when I look at like single player games coming out and I go, why would I buy this X game over Y game when they feel very similar?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Definitely
and it
feeling that.
doesn't, yeah, and I guess what would get my money at this point, I don't want to harp on, you know, a topic that has been covered previously, but which game's more finished on release? Like, what game is actually done?
And that's the thing. It's difficult in many ways to know nowadays, isn't it? It's like, which is why I think a lot of this. I'm sorry, this will probably feel quite tangential, but people who like
Go
rip
for it.
on reviewers all the time, and to be honest with you, like they're usually the best resource I personally have of knowing whether a game's worth getting anywhere near release. Like, people always say like, "Oh, don't listen to the reviewers, listen to what the people say," and then it's just like, but the reviewers are the ones who get the ones early, and they're the frontline people who will tell you this game is not finished, there is stuff missing, it's got a horrible monetization system, whatever it might be, and they will you listen to them, and that's the way of knowing for me. Otherwise, it's just yeah, it's just that there wouldn't really be, or you wouldn't know until it's too late, I guess is more my point. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a frustrating one.
I don't know who your designated guy is, but mine's Skill Up, and I'll check out when a game has like its 3-day grace period. And usually, what I like about their thumbnails is that they'll say in the thumbnail, "I feel this about this game," and then you can watch the 25-minute video to get the context. But there's been a lot more games recently where it's like, "I don't feel good about X game."
Well,
Like
just
this
that.
game needs right,
I mean,
and
for
it's for
me,
those reasons.
like for me, I hang out in a bunch of different communities, and so like what I'm thinking is like I don't really have a dedicated reviewer that I follow for newer releases. It's mostly just I wait for word of mouth, to tell me like if a game's worth picking up
Hmm.
and I mean like there's a difference like if it's part of an established series that I already like I'm probably gonna get that regardless. But yeah, it like for example like Celeste, I never saw any marketing for Celeste, but like it pretty much succeeded almost entirely on word of mouth, for people, going, oh my God, this is like an incredible game. And, like I played it, because of people who've been doing that. And I'm like, yeah, it's an incredible game. And another one that, sort of became like, one of my favorites of all time in recent years was East 8. Like, now, I mean, the E series, by Nihon Falcom, Cora, I think you know Nihon Falcom.
I do.
Yeah, like that, like okay, they're not like an indie studio, but they're not as big as a lot of the other major companies out right now, and like again, like I never saw too much marketing for their games, but because I heard a lot of people that I'm around talking up East 8 and other people talking about Trails, how much they like that, that's what sort of got me into Falcom games. That's what sort of so for me, it's not really a matter of what reviewers are saying or even what the wider masses are saying. It's more just if I see people who like a lot of the same stuff I do, talking about a game, I'm gonna be inclined to try it. That's just sort of I guess I don't want to call it a hard metric or anything for whether or not I try a game, but it's I guess you could call it a litmus almost, or something that's just sort of gonna incline me towards trying out a game. You know what I'm saying? Like wider marketing for a game, like big trailers for something I'm not really too interested in. Like that doesn't really do much for me in terms of getting excited for a game.
Hmm.
But again, like just knowing that hey, a lot of people who like the same stuff I do like this. That's what gets me interested. You know what I'm
Does
saying?
that go for AAA games as well? Like, not to stomp on your point a little bit, but the games that you listed out were either indie or incredibly niche, and so there wouldn't be like a dedicated reviewer base for those games anyways.
Right, and I mean, I think the bigger point, for me in that regard is, I don't really have a PS5. My PS4 has kind of been collecting dust, so I haven't really had too many of like the big AAA stuff outside of the Switch. But yeah, like for the ones that I do have a platform to use, yeah, that does sort of also extend to AAAs, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Just as a tangent, I call my PS4 my cable box now.
Wait, why?
Because it's where I watch all my streaming services on my couch.
Right. Okay. I don't know why I was thinking it's like you just had a lot of cables plugged into it, and that's why you called it your cable
Oh
box.
no, yeah,
I
I
don't
don't
know
know
why I
if
thought
Like what I was
there's
thinking.
if there's an
Yeah,
equivalent term in the
I was
UK
thinking something
for
different. Like I
cable.
was thinking, oh yeah, it's in the storage with all those other cables, like in that box. Like,
No, I use
that's
it
what I was thinking.
as my little. It's what I watch all my streaming services on when I want to relax on my couch instead of watch it on my computer.
I do remember, like, when I was at uni, this was 8 or so years ago. I do remember I didn't have a PC back then, but everyone on my course was a PC gamer, and they would always describe their consoles as Netflix machines, basically. So it
Yeah,
just kind of reminds me of that.
it's exactly that.
I do have my PS4, obviously because I have a PS5 which plays PS4 games anyway. My PS4 is now just a Blu-ray player, just sits in my front room. I just only use it for Blu-rays now.
Oh, nice.
I actually do
Okay.
want to go back to something Max said a bit earlier. Again, slightly tangential, but he mentioned about the sort of like the big budget CGI reveal trailers, and am I the only one who's just finding they do nothing for me anymore? Like every
I
time you
just
get one of
ignore
these,
them.
yeah, exactly. Nintendo Directs, Sony State of Plays, Microsoft things. I don't know what they call theirs, but this whenever they reveal a game, it's less so the content of the trailer than more so the game exists, it's coming, and it's just kind of like they do these massive CGI reveal trailers, and not every time, but 9 times out of 10. I just don't care about the content anymore.
Yeah.
My chief takeaway is this game exists, it is coming out, and not the actual
If
content of the trailer itself. Am I the only one?
yeah, if the video doesn't say gameplay trailer, I don't watch it.
Right. I mean, I think you're not the only one on that because, all right, here's a more modern example that I've heard, a lot of people sort of talking about. Crash Team Rumble. You've probably seen some trailers for that already, right? Or at
Yeah.
least like the initial one. And yeah, there are people genuinely excited for that game, but a lot of people, are talking about the fact that it's been this long since the game was originally announced, and we still have barely any idea of how it plays or how it works or anything like that. So, yeah, there are definitely people who, are turned off by, the fact that, okay, the game exists, but what is it? Y- Like, yeah, you know what I mean?
I remember asking that question when it was revealed. It was only a couple months ago, wasn't it? It was at the VGAs, I think.
Hmm.
Maybe, but yeah.
And I remember
Yeah,
asking at the time, what is the game? And no one could give me a straight answer. And it's quite funny to find out that no one still can give me a straight answer. No one actually knows what it is.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, the most you get, like, some descriptive text on the website, but, like, there's no, like, real match footage, for example. There's no, like, gameplay of, like, okay, this is the kind of experience you'll be having in this game. Like, no, and like, even the site's text description is kind of vague, so, yeah, it's, yeah, there is definitely, like, sort of a wider thing of, and like I mentioned before, some people are excited for Crash Team Rumble, but a lot of people are also like, okay, I'm not going to be excited for the game until I know what the game is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a good example of it. I think that's just them being not deliberately vague, or just being vague in general to the point where, like we said, a couple months later, people are still asking, what the hell is it? All we know is it's Crash. The only reason we have to be excited is because it's Crash. We don't know what it is. But my initial example was more so just trailers with a lot of style but not substance, if you kind of get what I'm
I
meaning.
know exactly what you're talking
Um,
about.
I'd say one company that's quite good at doing that is Blizzard. Any of their Overwatch trailers or their World of Warcraft trailers, even though I haven't played it, they are very engaging, they're exciting, they're incredibly well made, and they get me interested. But the large majority of companies just... my only takeaway is, okay, this game is going to come out at some point. Now show me actual gameplay, which we don't usually get
Right.
until like 6 months before release.
I mean, for a recent example, the Harry Potter game didn't even remotely pique my interest until we saw a combat trailer of how the spell fighting worked. Like, I wasn't even gonna look at it and went, oh,
Yeah,
you
I
can
mean,
juggle people with Leviosa. Okay, here we go.
all I really knew was it was a free roam Harry Potter game set in the
Yeah,
the 19th century, and that was it.
yeah. So I didn't give a crap about it until I saw how it played. At least as a small little pie slice.
And I mean, I do think, like, part of it depends on what kind of game you're talking about because, okay, if it's like a numbered entry in an established series, And okay, you could probably get away with like, just a blanket "it's coming" CGI trailer or whatever, just because okay, yeah, it's like okay, if you're making Crash 5 or Super Smash Brothers 6, for example, like okay, people have a general idea of what to expect gameplay wise from that and whether they'll
Yeah.
be interested or not. But if it's for, a newer IP or, a kind of game, that isn't really following up any, particular other kind of game, like Hogwarts Legacy you mentioned, that's a good example. Like, a lot of the marketing for that game really doesn't give you any idea of how the game works. And but sort of going back to the Smash example, like okay, yeah, you do get these like fairly elaborate trailers whenever they're revealing a new character or something. But even then, those trailers still do a better job of like teaching you like how the character works or what the gameplay is like just in the gameplay segments of those trailers, which you'd think, which is kind of funny because. It's these trailers to these other games like Crash Team Rumble or Hogwarts Legacy that could really use these gameplay segments in their trailers a lot more than the Smash trailers could. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
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 For
100%.
me, the sequel trailer that I jumped, or the sequel announcement that I jumped on, no questions asked, was Civ 6.
I mean, Civ is it's a good example of what Max said in that you know what you're going to get, really, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
just what's the difference this time around? Like,
I mean,
what is
yeah,
it going
Civ
to
4
add?
to Civ 5, they went squares to hexes, and you're like, oh, word, and then they stopped unit stacking. But for the most part, it's like you're gonna build a city, you're gonna put them around, you're gonna get a religion, you're gonna build some wonders, and you're gonna win in like 6 ways. What are the quality of life changes?
What I want to know is who are
Agenda
the
change.
leaders this time round.
Oh yeah. What's the new roster?
Yeah,
That's a good one.
it's a roster update like FIFA. No,
With some little stuff here and there, but I see that.
I feel like I'm constantly being tangential again, but while we're kind of on the topic of trailers, I also want to say, please God, game publishers everywhere, if your game isn't coming out within like the next 16 months, don't release a trailer for it. Like, can you guys believe the trailer for Elder Scrolls 6 came out in 2017? And we have seen nothing, not one peep from it
That happened
since.
so long. Yeah, I thought it was an
I
April
can't
Fool's
believe
joke at
it
this
because
point.
yeah, all right. I can't believe it because I forgot there was a trailer for Elder Scrolls 6. I forgot Elder
Yeah.
Scrolls 6 was a thing that was being made.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, with the Star
exactly.
Citizen, Starfield. What are they putting out now?
Starfield is supposed to be
Starfield.
out in like 3 or 4 months' time.
Yeah.
That's their next game, and then Elder Scrolls 6, and then Fallout 5, which will presumably be. I'm not even taking the piss. I think it's meant to be about 2030 or something. It comes out. Not a word of a lie for Fallout 5, but yeah. Just when I realized that, because I was just scrolling through YouTube, it came up and like, oh yeah, they revealed a trailer for it, didn't they? Many years back, 2017. This May, it will be 6 fucking years old, and we have not seen a single damn thing about that game since then. All we've had is this 30-second long trailer flying over some misty mountains and a title. That was it. That was it. Game companies, please God, stop announcing games so early. It's driving me nuts.
I would like to make, one like noteworthy exception, and that's when like, there's like, something major comes up and they have to restart development, for example, like, Metroid Prime 4, they were like, okay, when that was announced, they probably expected that they would have like a proper gameplay trailer in like a year or something, but as we all know, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And something happened behind the scenes like made them had to restart development entirely. And they were transparent about that, so I give them a pass on that. But yeah, in a lot of other cases, it's like, okay, either have something ready to show in a reasonable amount of time, or tell us why you don't.
Yeah, I think Nintendo's, or Metro Prime 4 specifically, is a good example of them. They communicated. They could have very easily just said nothing, but they came out and said, look, we have to restart the game from the beginning, and it is going to mean it's going to be several years. And granted, it's been a long time since they gave that update, and we haven't had anything since then, but I will take that over blanket radio silence that we get from Bethesda, etc.
True.
Sorry, rant over. That was all. That was all I wanted to say. It's just. I just find it frustrating. If you're revealing a game, it should be out at most 24 months after that point. Then that's like end of the tether sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything left. I kind of covered all the things that I want to talk about outside of maybe like anti-cheat and how annoying like de novo is for performance.
I
But
feel like that could be a whole other topic. Like that could be a
yeah,
whole other episode of this thing.
and I don't want to open up that can of worms at this point. So
Yeah.
so I didn't really want to broach it.
That's fair enough. I'm not sure I'd have a huge amount to. Maybe we should get Solly on for that episode. She can use her text to speech thing because she's got a lot to talk about on that.
That would be fun.
Chicken Stephen Hawking into the
yeah. But yeah, that you are right. I think that's probably best. We could have like a general discussion about like cheating, hacking, anti-cheat, that sort of thing. That could make for an interesting topic. But no, Max, did you have anything else you wanted to bring up?
No, I think I said pretty much everything I wanted to say on this.
Cool, fair enough. All right, well, I think we will leave it there then, since we've kind of reached the end of what it was we wanted to discuss. So thank you very much for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen. This has been episode 9 of TPOG, the podcast of gaming. We are going to be going on a bit of a brief break right about now. I don't know how long, maybe 2 weeks to 4 weeks. We will, of course, keep you updated on the Discord channel, and the next episode will go up when it goes up, but we're just going to take some time to sort of refine the process, figure out what it is we want to do and what we want to achieve, and we'll obviously get back to you when we figure something out. Do not fear, TPOG will return. We just need a little bit of time to sort of make things what we want them to be. But until such time, I've been Parasloth, this has been Cora.
Bye-bye.
And Max.
See ya.
And we will see you next time.